Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar with Mono Solutions, Defining the Optimal Service Model for SMBs. My name is Lizzie, Senior Account Manager for Localogy, and I will be your host for today's event. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and will be circulated to all attendees with a presentation within 24 hours of the broadcast. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end. You can, however, ask questions at any time during the broadcast by using the question window in your control panel. If your questions are not answered during the recording, someone will follow up with you post-webinar. We're going to start with one of our speakers today, who's Senior Analyst from Localogy, Charles Laughlin. I'm going to go ahead and send it over to you to kick things off, Charles.
Thank you, Lizzie, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today. We really appreciate your participation in this webinar, and I should go back to the speaker slide and introduce my co-presenter today, Matt Maturgia from he's GM America's VP Sales at Mono Solutions. Matt, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, Charles. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Great. Thanks for joining us today. So what I want to do to start off is talk a little bit about this webinar is really a companion piece to a white paper that we just produced with Mono, and it's either currently or about to be available on the Localogy site, and you'll also be sent information on how to access the report. It's also available on Mono Solutions website, and the report, just in brief, was based on a small business survey, which will form the basis of much of this presentation webinar today, where we tried to get at a basic question, which is really what comprises the optimal sort of SaaS service model for small businesses. You know, what should go into it, what technologies, what sort of the marriage between technology and personal service. We got into all of those questions with a sample of small business owners and operators. And so that forms the basis of both the white paper and this webinar. So, what we want to cover today is sort of what is the as a service that, you know, the SaaS acronym, software as a service. This is about the as a service piece, and what does that really mean to small businesses, and and really how can it be a value driver for your company? And all of these issues that we list here are sort of drive really at this. They're at this heart of what solutions providers struggle with all the time to try to differentiate using service and sort of what is the right optimal mix, both from a cost and from a effectiveness standpoint. So we'll get into all that through the course of this webinar. So again, sort of we talk about software as a service, and I would sort of argue that the as a service piece gets a little bit less attention than it should. I think, certainly in the content I see around the surveys I see, I think there's not enough sort of intelligence around what really defines an optimal service model. So that's really what we're going to get into. Okay, so when we talk about service as a differentiator, there's many components of service. Certainly in the report, I kind of talk about how many very well-known companies, FreshBooks is one of the ones we mentioned, where many of them don't have even significant sales organizations, but they do have invest a lot in service, and they differentiate based on service. And FreshBooks is one. There's a number of lesser known companies that certainly focus on that more so than anything else, other than perhaps product, in order to really drive retention, upsell, and all those other things. So Matt, maybe you can talk about, from a Mono perspective, what you think of as service as a differentiator. What does that mean from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think you're right, Charles. Like when I think about maybe software generally, but specifically sort of the MarTech stack and agency services, I think generally those have kind of become commoditized a little bit, I'd argue. Especially as sort of software has become democratized. So I think for the purposes of this study and also this webinar, whether you like it or not, like service is that differentiator. And I think when we say service, it's not just customer support, but it's how you market your packaging or your go-to-market packaging, your branding, your approach to acquisition. It's all these sort of factors that bundle together to give you that opportunity to differentiate with the service layer.
Cool. Yeah, I would agree. So just again, for purposes of this, both the white paper and this webinar, we kind of break service down into 3 models, and they're pretty straightforward. And we've talked about this before with other surveys and reports we've done with you guys with Mono.
I think the last 3 at least.
Perhaps, yeah. What we don't talk about is customer acquisition models here, but these are service models, and it's DIY. Everyone knows what that is. Do it for me. That's the full service white glove. The one in the middle, I think, is probably the one we're going to concentrate on most, and that's sort of the midpoint between the other two, where there's a DIY elements and then DIFM elements into sort of the optimal mix between those two to create that sort of service model that drives the most value. And so we're going to talk about how to put that together, essentially. Okay, so just a little bit about the nature of the survey. It was a sample of 309. We shot for 300 and got a few extra in the process. And the U.S. small businesses, which we define as fewer than 500 employees, was conducted in late October, or from early to mid-October, excuse me. And we broke it down. We required participants to be in one of these vertical categories in order to have it be sort of relevant to most of our audience out there. So just with that, we're going to share a couple of quick insights on the sample, the survey sample, and who was responding. And these were small businesses that were heavily, almost none had no online presence at all. Most have a website, most have some sort of social presence, as you can see here. So this is an audience or a survey sample that is online and is active online. So it's a question of then, how do they make the most of that? So this was not a sort of not yet having a website audience. What we found is that service, they do access service, and generally, they're generally a satisfied, I guess the best way to describe them, that this is a generally satisfied audience with the survey they've received. But as you will see later on, there's a lot of gaps that we identified that present great opportunities to drive more value with service. Okay, so we're going to move on to some key learnings from this. And Matt, why don't you kind of walk us through what those, we broke this down into 5. Why don't you kind of lead us off on this?
Yeah, so thanks, Charles. And we pulled out 5 key learnings from this study, and we're going to dive into each one of these in the next couple of slides more in depth. But we're going to be looking at, first and foremost is 2020. So I don't think you can have, unfortunately, a webinar where you don't mention COVID. But the first learning that we had is COVID's accelerated the need for service. Number 2, I actually thought this was most interesting to me when we got the survey results back, and that's that there's this delta basically between the service that providers are giving versus the service that SMBs prefer. So we'll talk about that. Unsurprisingly to most, but maybe disappointing to some, is that personal service does still matter. So when we talk about, software as a service, everybody wants to drop that last S because it's not scalable. These SMBs do want personal service, but the upside being that next bullet point is that based off of what we got back and what we see in the market, we think there's an untapped potential to automate and scale service. And then the final point that we'll talk about is that business owners, going back to that sort of do it with me service model, which like you said, Charles, we've been talking about for a while. This survey sort of gives us that feedback that they're definitely open to collaborate and open to have some sort of flexibility in the service model that they receive. So we talk about the first one, which is COVID accelerating the need for service. I think I'm making a presumption here, but I think a lot of companies saw this. We certainly did in our business, and that's that is that the SMBs that were able to survive. COVID completely accelerated the digital transformation in the shift to the cloud that Charles, you've been tracking for years, that was already happening. So it took what was happening and kind of put it into overdrive. And if I look at mono alone, and some of the survey data definitely supported this, we saw a huge increase in adoption in the sort of more transactional elements of our platform. Those being, we have a scheduling tool, so SMBs that were looking to maybe have scheduled appointments for retail or meet online with their customers. We also saw this, of course, with e-commerce as everybody moved online to transact and adapt. But the sort of other side of that, of course, is while these SMBs were really eager in adopting all this new technology, it definitely ramped up the need for some hand-holding to get them up and running and successful. And I think that got encompassed by this quote here from Sherilyn King, who's VP of Sales and Marketing at YP Canada. There seemed to be, despite the ambitions of SMBs to self-serve, there definitely was this delta where they were getting outpaced by their actual abilities. And so, Yellow Pages, like others, saw sort of an increase in support that they had to provide for some of these new services they're offering, like e-commerce.
Great. So the second learning, again, is that, where the one Matt wanted to highlight is that there's a gap in the service model, but in other words, in the gap between what companies are delivering and the service modes that small businesses prefer. So we kind of broke it down into areas where there was alignment and areas where there was a lack of alignment. So these three areas where what SMBs expressed preference for was pretty much in line with the service that they were receiving, the service mode they were receiving from their service provider, their solutions provider. So most who asked for, who liked email, were getting email. Chatbots still not super popular, but their day will come. And the toll-free number, again, that was pretty much in line. It's interesting that there's three. These three were ones that we saw a real gap. And the 58% want online request form, or excuse me, offering, they don't want online request forms. It's heavily offered, but not particularly in demand. That's kind of a sterile, you fill out the form, you don't know what's going to happen. I don't think it's super high on the user experience spectrum. Callback option, this is an interesting one. 6% offer it, and this is, to be clear, where you call, they can't get through to a service rep, and they say, would you like, instead of waiting on hold and listening to bad music, would you like us to give you a call back when a service rep opens up? And there's a pretty good gap there. Also, text messaging, only 2% of providers are offering it. 20% of SMBs prefer it. So on the last two in particular, perhaps all three of these, one observation I made about this was that these seem to suggest a little bit of sort of the consumer experience sort of bleeding over into small business expectations, because small businesses they're all consumers as well, right? We all are. Anyone who has a business hat and a consumer hat, and those aren't always easily separated. And so I think a lot of people have experienced that callback option sort of dealing with their bank or their, some utility or something where they have to call for a billing question or whatever it is. And they're given this option because it's an hour-long wait or something like that. And that's a nice feature. I think most of us like that feature. Text messaging, we all like to communicate via text. No one really likes to talk to anybody anymore. And so, and yet only 2% of providers are offering this. I think, these all offer opportunities to offer arguably scalable communication modes that are, depending on whether there's automation behind the service, that would sort of drive better consumer or customer experience. Okay, so learning number 3.
The personal service still matters, which is, like I said earlier, I think this is probably both an opportunity as well as a disappointment for those of you listening that are providing service. And the data painted, I think, a pretty clear picture on the preference of SMBs for service. So you can see here 57% of SMBs, they did want access to a dedicated sales rep or customer service rep. Of course, that's expensive to scale. 44% of the small businesses, they wanted a regular scheduled check-in with their customer service rep, which is unfortunately also expensive and difficult to scale. So, if we go to the next slide, again, this is another area where there was a mismatch in terms of the wants and the reality of the SMB and the provider, and that only 36% of the providers that we surveyed were actually offering the dedicated customer service rep. Where again, the vast, at least the majority of 57% of SMBs wanted a dedicated customer service rep. So the good news is, again, the double-edged sword, right? If you're offering this, great, you've got a clear differentiator. But if you're not, this might be some place where you're going to want to look to maybe scale your service. And I think this leads into the next learning, which should be optimistic for those who aren't already offering dedicated service reps, is that we do actually, from the data that we got back in this report, we do actually think there is opportunity, at least an untapped potential for automation and service. So, some of these data points that we got back from the SMBs, 47% said they wanted help setting up their software. 46% said, they went on their own to go get help when looking to learn about specific function, and 36% wanted, sort of an automated report or something that showed them the ROI. And I think the good news about those, Charles, if we hit that next slide, is that that kind of opens up some of these opportunities for a little bit more automation and self-service within that service stack. So some of the ideas, of course, that are available would be knowledge bases on online content resource libraries. So these SMBs are saying, hey, I'm willing to go sort of try to learn, please give me the tools. Same thing with e-learning courses and tutorials. Something that we are definitely experimenting, I know at Mono and many other product companies are, is having sort of in-tool guidance and setup wizards to sort of guide the user along to getting over that engagement a gap. And then on the service side, there's some opportunities where you can both automate reports and dashboards, and also sort of mimic this personal service with things like regularly scheduled webinars, pre-recorded things like that feel a little bit more like service, but are of course less expensive than having just a dedicated rep waiting for a phone call. So hopefully minimizing some of that personal touch.
Yeah, we're going to probably talk a little more about the content piece, but these things, I think they're all as good as the quality of the content and also the ease of use of the platform. So I think you can scale this up, but it has to be good. And I think there's
for sure
probably some effort, something front loaded in terms of the effort to create this, and then probably some ongoing challenges as well. But anything that's one to many versus one to one certainly improves the cost profile. So we have a quote here from someone we talked to in the report. And what this gets to, I'm not going to just read this verbatim, but what it gets to is this notion that, kind of when we talk about the DIY, DIWM, DIFM, that continuum of service models, what Joachim Helfer, who many of you may know, at Advantigo, I don't pronounce that right. The idea is using DIY to train the customer to use DIY for the simple things. In his case, it's, I need to update the hours of my retail business, something that's pretty COVID, common in the COVID era, more so than it was perhaps before. And, you know, that's very easy to do. Why don't we just train them to do these simple things so that we can focus our service time, not on, you know, like a small business hates picking up the phone and having somebody ask, when do you close? Because that's it's taking time away from doing something that's going to make them money. But in the same token, you don't want that service time to be dedicated to simple, repeatable things. Instead, devote it to higher value interactions that could lead to higher retention, upsell, and so on. So that's kind of his point here. So learning number 5, business owners want more collaboration. I think this is probably one of the, my opinion, one of the bigger findings here. So one of the things that and what this really means is that they're kind of almost to the point of the quote we just shared. They don't want the service interactions to just be about routine things like, you know, onboarding or troubleshooting, kind of common, you know, challenges with the software. They really want to use it for more higher value interactions, like help me really get more out of the solution I'm using. So we actually asked sort of by solution, you know, how much interaction they wanted. And you can see that, you know, they want more sort of guidance on how to use the product. And it's highest amongst those using CRM. These are kind of the 3 of the higher ones, websites, email marketing campaigns, and so on. So tell me how to get more out of it. That came through across the board, but particularly with these solutions. And so here's a quote from this guy, Matt Maturgy. Kind of a big deal.
I don't know him.
You know, from the report, but basically this whole notion, you know, that, you know, do it with me, which is sort of that sort of not too hot, not too cold model that we're talking about. You know, it's about ensuring collaboration. This collaboration is where the magic happens, I think, with service, with personalized service in particular. Okay, yeah.
So I think, you know, not to toot my own horn on agreeing with that quote, but
He's a pretty smart guy, that man. Yeah.
Pretty spot on, right? But yeah. Collaboration, I think, is, you know, it is the summary here. So I think there was sort of 2 big conclusions that we at least came to from interpreting this data. Number 1 is, you know, this idea that, of course, these SMBs, like, they're not hapless, but they definitely look to their providers for advice and guidance. So, you know, it is that opportunity to just not be, like you said, answering the phone to update hours, but hey, you know, answering the phone actually provides some value and advice, and that's where you are going to differentiate yourself in terms of service, right? Because these SMBs don't want to call someone to just update their hours. That probably takes more effort out of them. They want to look to the providers as being, you know, that expert. So, you know, that's that first conclusion is you have to essentially be there to set these SMBs up for success. Obviously, we think that's through this do it with me approach, but it's making sure that you're sort of providing that helping hand and ensuring that these SMBs don't fail. And the second conclusion that we came to, Charles, if you want to hit that next slide, is there is a path to scalable service model. And of course, we've alluded to this already, but you know, it's sort of combining bespoke service with automation, and both encouraging, but probably I would say more importantly, enabling your small business users to manage those routine tasks themselves, so that you can spend the time, you know, sort of having those personal touch points. I always argue being more of that that expert. I almost got through this webinar without saying trusted advisor. So what is the
well done.
Yeah. What is the do it with me model? Of course, we've been talking about this. When I say we, you and I, Charles, as you mentioned at the top of the call, we've sort of built up to this report with a couple of others. Of course, they're available at Localogy, where we've been talking about both from service and acquisition, you know, this ultimate model we call do it with me. I got a text from somebody in the industry after I did one of these things when I said that Mono made up the "do it with me" term. I don't know if we made it up. I'll backtrack on that, but we've definitely been talking about it for a long time.
You've popularized it, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll popularized it. But it's this sweet spot between time, skills, and budget. And we've always believed it's, of course, the ideal service model for service providers and agencies because it does scale and it can be cost effective. But I think what's cool is the data that we got back from these SMBs tells us that they're really open to this model and in many ways actually prefer it as well. And so how do you get there as a provider? It's having that bespoke service. Charles, you mentioned a lot of these product-led growth type companies, they might not even have sales, so they have these customer service agents that are the experts but are sort of selling without selling. So there's having that bespoke service, augmenting it with automation. So having obviously the content libraries and the content and things like that available for self-service, but also having the things like the request callback, the live chat, which isn't so popular right now, but I think maybe that's, in my opinion, that maybe that's just because live chat hasn't had its moment yet. Maybe it's been a bad experience for some right now. I think that will get better.
I think I agree with you. I think the experience ultimately catches up with, and I think certainly service providers are sort of hoping as much because it's very good from the service provider standpoint. It has to become as good from the customer standpoint. I don't think we're there yet, but eventually, yeah.
Eventually. And same thing with SMS and text. We know that the SMBs definitely prefer that, or at least they're getting there. I think if Neil Politics listening, he's probably celebrating as he's been trying to kill the phone and the voicemail.
Kill voicemail, yeah.
But I think also when you talk about automation, it's also being proactive. So like Charles, you gave I'll go back to that example about updating your hours. You see this a lot with even like Google My Business, where if Martin Luther King Day or Christmas or whatever is coming up, you get that email that says, "Hey, do you have holiday hours? Click here to update." Right. So doing those things also is going to reduce the burden on your support team so that they can focus on that bespoke service.
All right, so here's an example. You want to talk about this?
Yeah, well, I can definitely talk to this about this because it's us. But I did mention it. Some of the things that we're doing for our partners to help them in this realm is, certainly we've invested a lot into our own education. We have e-learning courses for our partners, but we also have fully white labeled knowledge bases that our partners can utilize with videos and tutorials and search and all that good stuff. So that's sort of like base level step one. I think what we've been experimenting with a lot more lately, and we've used third-party tools like AppQues and others, is we've been really looking at what users are actually doing in our tool, and then we've been trying to build both in-tool guidance at sort of both for onboarding, so like getting started, but also sort of at those sort of choke points of where, in our case, ultimately we want the small business to publish the website, right? So trying to take out those roadblocks proactively with that in-tool guidance and assistance so that they can get over that hump before they take that step to reach out to you. And I think the second example that we have from a partner perspective comes from one of our partners, Equid, the e-commerce tool, of course. They have what I would say is some really great in-tool getting started guidance. So, going back to that e-commerce example, setting up an e-commerce store obviously is not easy. for an SMB. It's also very labor intensive for our service partners. I think historically it's why a lot of the agencies and digital service providers that we work with have shied away from e-commerce, is because it has been a level of service that they've wanted to avoid. I think with COVID, that's become unavoidable, and they need to offer it. And Equid's done a really great job, I think, of having that guidance and tool that helps the SMB get over that hump on their own and get that shop set up in a relatively easy manner. And also what they do for their partners, they have a really great white label. They use a third-party platform, and they built up this white label content library that has a plethora of stuff that's available for all of their reselling partners to utilize in terms of that sort of self-support and content library. So, those are just two ways I think you can kind of approach it from a product perspective. Of course, as a agency or a service provider, you should definitely be looking at your the companies that you're working with, your vendors, to be providing that help to you to help you get to this do it with me model.
All right. Well, I think thanks, Matt. And I think we can go to questions now. I think we have a couple queued up here. And by the way, if anyone wants to add a question, it's not too late. Just go to the questions window and type in your question. So the first one is kind of talking about these content libraries we've been discussing. Is what kind of investment is required to make this good? I don't know if we have a dollar amount, but I think you have a sense of the just the amount of effort it takes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to talk to finance for the dollar amount, but I can tell you at Mono, we started investing pretty heavily in this going back a couple of years ago. And I think the biggest thing, there's two things probably to think about. And number one is, there is quite a bit of upfront investment in terms of documentation and the tutorials and things like that. But more importantly, at least for us, this is definitely true, and it should be across the board, is you essentially need at least a team member or a team that's going to sort of straddle between the product team and the marketing team and really be experts on the platform, because there's a deep level of collaboration where we're putting releases out multiple times a week, and that's generally speaking how most SaaS companies are operating now, which means this content becomes stale pretty quickly. So
that was what I was curious about, is that if it's not regularly updated and fresh, it loses value. I imagine it loses value very quickly.
Yeah, I think it loses value, and then it ultimately that's what you don't want, right? Because that's going to be extremely frustrating when
that actually makes things worse, right?
Yeah. Right. And then you're going to get the angry call, right? So you're not going to avoid the customer service call. You're going to get a call. And
you're going to have more of them, right. So so it's like a big upfront investment and a fairly substantial ongoing sort of nurturing curation process. Yeah. So next question is one I'm actually have thought about a lot. Well, all the SMEs are adding e-commerce solutions to their digital presence because of COVID. Will they continue doing e-commerce after the pandemic? I have a point of view on this, but I'd like to hear what you have to say, man.
Well, yeah, likewise. I'm actually curious what you have to say, but in my opinion, I think consumer behavior, has probably changed, and consumer expectations has changed to the point where I think it's a lasting trend. And the reason why, obviously I've been buying things online for a while. That's been my expectation. But I even look at my parents who are in their 70s, and they're ordering their groceries online, and they're ordering things. And last year, e-commerce was a pain. It's not like they're not like totally out there where they didn't know what it was or anything, but now it's become the norm for them. So that's what kind of drives my thought. I'm curious on your
Well,
opinion.
I agree with that. I mean, and if you listen to, well, you know, if you listen to anyone, you just look at the data, you know, the whole acceleration of e-commerce was, you know, it's about a decade's worth in several weeks, you know, or something like that this year. And that is absolutely real. I guess where small businesses come, I have a little bit of skepticism that I think it's a function of if a small business, like I'm talking about like a single location retailer or something like that, um, doesn't discover that they can expand their market, um, you know, instead of opening the new location, e-commerce, in a sense, opens several new locations for them. And I think that takes up maybe a little bit of sophistication on the business owner's part. Maybe partners can help with that, but ultimately, if they can't execute that, or they don't, then they'll probably look at it as something that just sort of I had to do because of the pandemic, and they may not stick with it. So I think it's one of those things where it goes up and then it comes down, but it comes down to a level much higher than the original point before the
Yep.
crisis. So I don't think it's a universal, so everybody who adopts e-commerce continues with it. I think there will be a rollback, but it won't be a rollback to the before times. It'll be still a new normal rollback, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's
Well,
sort of like
and
a
then maybe it's a
slightly more sanguine version of your answer.
yeah, and maybe it's an opportunity for these SMBs, right? If they saw success in e-commerce, and I mean, I use the term e-commerce, I think, pretty loosely. You know, of course, there's, hey, I went on to your website and I ordered and it got delivered to me. But I
Yeah,
think even
order
these
online,
like,
pick up is that,
yeah,
I guess,
retail
if we're
stores.
calling that e-commerce, sure, yeah. And
Yeah.
I would probably call it e-commerce. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Let's go one more question. So yeah, here's another interesting one. And I think, well, anyway, I'll just ask the question, then we can add it around. Can you get around investing heavily in service by instead just building a really great product? I think it's an interesting question, but my first take on that would be sure your product is really great, or you don't just think it's really great. So that would be my answer, my snarky answer to that. But I don't know what
Yeah,
you
I
think.
don't know if this is also snarky, but I guess in an ideal world, yes.
Yeah. Mhm.
But you know, I think that goes to like one of the first slides in this deck, where yeah, in an ideal world, I think everybody would like to drop service. Every software company would be a heck of a lot more profitable if they didn't have to have the service burden. But I think what you see is opposite. Even these, you know, super high growth product led growth companies that, you know, don't have sales and have all this, you know, organic growth through their product, they have huge I mean, the investment gets shifted, I just think,
Yep.
from sales
Yep.
to service.
That's true. Well, Mark McLeod, he used to run SurePath Capital, former CFO of FreshBooks. Interviewed him a bunch of times over the course of, you know, covering small business SaaS. And, you know, one of the things he said to me at least once was that small, you know, SaaS companies think they can't afford service, but really the reality is they can't afford not to have a robust service channel. And I think that's probably true across the board.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a nice conclusion for this, in the sense that that's kind of what the data told us, right? Is that service is really a differentiator.
Yep, exactly. All right, thank you, Matt. That was a lot of fun.
Yes.
Thank you, our
Likewise.
audience. If you want to get hold of either of us for any reason, here's our stats or whatever, our details. And I guess just thanks for joining us. Appreciate you all sticking around. So, Lizzie, you want to take us out?
Sure. Well, thank you both to you and Matt for this great webinar and great questions and discussions as well. And I do also want to thank Mono Solutions for putting together the webinar for us. And thank you, Charles, for your work on behalf of Localogy on this white paper. Just a few more items from Localogy before we end today's webinar. You will be able to view today's broadcast along with previous webinars on our website, localogy.com. Just navigate to Research and Resources and drop down to Webinars. If you did attend this webinar, you will receive an email within 24 hours that includes the webinar link as well as the download for the Mono Solutions white paper. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please be sure to visit localogy.com and subscribe for updates to be the first to know about future webinars. I hope everyone has a great day.